The grand halls of the Galactic Unity Council were vast and filled with the hum of technology. Above, shimmering lights floated, casting soft glows over the rich, metallic surfaces of the Council's meeting chamber. Among the many species present, Princess Aloria of the Zerthian Empire stood tall and proud, her violet eyes surveying the crowd. At only 18 years old, she was already a symbol of power and grace within the galaxy. Her silver armor, crafted from a rare, lightweight metal, reflected the surrounding lights as she moved, and the soft hum of her bioenhancements whispered in the air. Zerthians, known for their incredible strength and psychic abilities, were often viewed as one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Today, however, she was more than just a princess. Today, she was also a proud skeptic. The Earth delegation, led by Commander Jason Ward, had arrived earlier. Jason was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements smooth despite the weight of his armor. Unlike Aloria, who wore armor as a second skin, Jason's armor was bulky and rough, built for practical combat rather than elegance. It was clear that his suit had seen countless battles, its surface scratched and scarred from the harshest of conditions. The dull gray and black coloring seemed out of place against the brilliant silver of the Zerthian elites. Aloria couldn't help but smile slightly as she watched Jason stand beside his fellow humans, all looking out of place in the Grand Hall. To her, Earth's technology appeared primitive and outdated, while the Zerthians had long mastered the art of bioenhancement and had sleek, form-fitting armor that responded to their very thoughts. Humans were still reliant on bulky metal shells. It was almost laughable. Is that really the best your people can do? Aloria's voice rang out across the hall, her tone both playful and mocking. Her words were directed at Jason, who was standing across from her, his helmet still firmly in place. His eyes, though hidden behind the visor, seemed calm and unbothered. The other members of the council turned to look, some shifting uncomfortably. Aloria's reputation for sharp wit and her ruthless nature was well known, and no one dared challenge her in such a public setting. But Jason was different. His gaze remained steady. "It works," Jason replied simply, his voice muffled through the comms in his helmet. "Better than you'd think." Aloria smirked. "I've seen Zerthian warriors fight with nothing more than their minds and their willpower. They don't need armor to survive. You Earthlings are clearly behind the times." She stepped forward, circling him, her eyes scanning his armor with disdain. "I almost pity you. You wear that like a shield for your weakness." Jason didn't move. He remained silent for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. The princess continued to circle them, clearly enjoying herself. She was used to being the center of attention, and the way the other council members watched her, some with quiet amusement, only fed her ego. "Tell me, Commander Ward," she continued, now standing before him, her eyes fixed on his helmet. "How does it feel to hide behind metal? To need such protection?" Jason's gaze finally met hers, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on his face. "You may be right about one thing," he said, his voice calm but carrying a slight edge. "I do need protection, but not from what you think." Aloria tilted her head, slightly confused by his response. She was used to humans cowering before her, trying to defend themselves with empty words. But there was something in Jason's posture, something in the way he stood, as if he were completely certain of himself. It made her pause, just for a second. "And what do you mean by that?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Jason's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of arrogance. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. He raised a hand slowly, and with a soft click, he began to unseal the first layer of his armor. Aloria watched, intrigued, but still sure that his actions were simply for show. Humans had their pride, and it was clear that Jason was attempting to keep some measure of dignity in the face of her ridicule. But as Jason continued to remove his armor piece by piece, her amusement began to fade. She saw something that she hadn't expected. Beneath his bulky armor, Jason wore a simple undersuit, but his body was covered in faint scars and marks, evidence of countless battles and struggles. His muscles were lean but defined, and his posture remained unwavering, despite being unprotected. "What are you doing?" Aloria asked, her voice no longer mocking but curious. Jason didn't respond immediately. He simply continued to remove the last layers of his armor, now standing before her in only his undersuit. There was no showmanship, no grand gesture. His stance was humble, yet something about him radiated a quiet power. Finally, when all his armor had been removed, Jason looked directly at Aloria, his eyes unmasked. "I don't need armor to prove that I'm strong," he said softly. "What makes me strong isn't what I wear or the weapons I carry. It's my will to protect those I care about. That's what gives me strength." Aloria stared at him, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. She had always viewed humans as weak, relying on their technology to protect them. But now, for the first time, she felt a strange shift. Maybe there was more to them than she realized. Jason stood still, waiting for her reaction, but inside, he knew that the challenge had only just begun. He was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant proving to her just how wrong she had been. After Jason removed his armor, the room fell silent. The other delegates exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what had just happened. Aloria stood motionless, her eyes narrowing as she studied the human commander. She had never seen anyone like him before. His calm demeanor, his quiet strength, and the lack of any arrogance in his actions were disorienting. For a moment, Aloria felt a strange knot in her stomach. She had assumed that humans were weak, unable to defend themselves without their heavy, clunky armor. But now, Jason stood before her, unarmed and vulnerable. Yet there was something about him that made her uneasy. "You really are something else, aren't you?" Aloria said at last, breaking the silence. Her voice was no longer mocking, but rather tinged with genuine curiosity. Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't flinch. His confidence wasn't in his armor, nor in his weapons. It was in himself. Humanity had survived countless wars, disasters, and challenges. It was their adaptability, their determination, that made them strong. "I've seen many kinds of warriors in my time," Aloria continued, her voice softer now, "but none quite like you. Your people, you're different." Jason nodded. "We are. We fight not just with our bodies, but with our minds and our hearts." Aloria looked at him thoughtfully. She had expected him to boast or try to convince her of humanity's strength in some flashy way. But instead, Jason spoke simply, as if it was a fact everyone should already understand. It wasn't boastful, but it was powerful in its own quiet way. "I thought you humans were all about technology and weapons," she said, stepping closer to him. "You hide behind those machines, thinking they make you strong. But now I see." Jason raised an eyebrow. "See what?" Aloria's violet eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Jason noticed a flicker of respect in her gaze. "I see that maybe your strength isn't what I thought it was." Her voice was so quiet that Jason had to strain to hear it. There was a pause, and then she stepped back, crossing her arms. "I still think your armor is ridiculous, though, but maybe you're not so weak after all." She allowed herself a small smile. Jason couldn't help but grin. "I'll take that as a compliment." Aloria laughed lightly, the sound soft and melodic. The tension in the room seemed to ease, as if the air had lightened between them. Jason wasn't sure why, but he felt like they were beginning to understand each other, even if only a little. "So what now?" she asked, her playful smile fading into something more thoughtful. Jason raised his hand, gesturing to the vast chamber around them. "Now we do what we came here to do. We talk. We share our ideas. We make the future better for everyone. That's what matters, isn't it?" Aloria looked at him, a little surprised by the sincerity in his words. She had expected humans to be focused only on their own interests, but Jason seemed genuinely interested in the well-being of others. There was no trace of the selfishness or pride she often saw in other species. Perhaps, she said slowly, "You're right. Maybe this is just the beginning." She extended her hand toward him, an unexpected gesture of peace. "But tell me this, Commander Ward. Do you really think that without your armor, you could survive in a place like Earth?" Jason glanced at her hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "I've survived worse, Princess. Believe me." Aloria smiled again, but this time was a little more genuine. She was beginning to respect this human more than she had expected. His quiet strength, his belief in his people, and his willingness to stand firm even without the protection of armor were things she hadn't anticipated. "I'll be watching you, human," Aloria said, stepping back. Her voice was playful but carried a hint of seriousness. "You've piqued my interest. Let's see if you can keep up with me." Jason chuckled. "I don't need to keep up. I just need to be myself." They both laughed then, the tension between them breaking completely. For the first time, Aloria saw Jason as more than just a symbol of Earth's weakness. He wasn't like the other humans she had encountered, the ones who seemed to rely so heavily on their technology. This human was something different, something that made her want to learn more. As the meeting began, Jason and Aloria found themselves sitting next to each other, their earlier exchange lingering in the back of their minds. The other delegates whispered and exchanged glances, but neither Aloria nor Jason paid them any attention. They were too busy engaging in quiet conversation, debating ideas and solutions for the future of the galaxy. The Earth delegation was still small, but the humans had a way of holding their ground. Aloria had seen it for herself. "You know," she said softly, after a few moments of silence, "you might just be the first human I've met who isn't completely arrogant or foolish." Jason turned toward her, a warm smile playing on his lips. "I'm not arrogant. I just believe in humanity." Aloria glanced at him, the flicker of respect still in her eyes. "I think I'm starting to see that." As they continued to speak, the possibility of something new, something unexpected, began to take shape between them. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was big enough for humans and Xerthians to find common ground. And if they could work together, who knew what they could accomplish? The day after the meeting, things felt different. Aloria couldn't quite place it, but she could sense that the atmosphere around Jason and herself had changed. There was something new in the air, something deeper than the usual political formalities. She had always considered herself an expert at reading others, but Jason was different. He wasn't like the others she had encountered, the ones who tried to impress her with their status, their wealth, or their power. Jason's strength was quiet, humble, and more real than anything she had ever seen. As the delegation made its way through the council's grand hall, Aloria found herself glancing at Jason more than once. She couldn't help it. He wasn't just the human ambassador. He was a mystery she wanted to solve. She had to know what made him tick. Later that evening, after the council sessions had ended, Aloria found herself walking through the corridors of the council station, her mind still spinning from their earlier conversations. She needed some time to think. The strange respect she felt for Jason continued to grow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important. As she passed by a quiet room, she paused when she saw Jason standing near a window, looking out into the endless expanse of stars. His armor was nowhere in sight, and for a moment, Aloria thought he looked almost vulnerable. She stepped inside, her footsteps light but purposeful. Jason turned as she entered, a slight surprise crossing his face. He had not expected anyone to seek him out this late. "Princess Aloria," he said, his voice calm, but there was something softer about it, as if the weight of the day had left him more relaxed than before. "I wasn't expecting company." Aloria crossed the room, stopping a few steps away from him. She had never been one to shy away from speaking her mind, and now was no different. "I need to ask you something," she said, her tone more serious than before. "Something about you. I don't understand it. Jason raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected her to confront him so directly. Go on, he said, his curiosity piqued. Aloria paused, trying to find the right words. You said you don't need armor to be strong. That's something I've never heard from anyone before. Not from Xerthians. Not from anyone. So why? Why do you believe that? Jason took a deep breath and turned his gaze back to the stars. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. Because it's true. Aloria stepped closer. But you're human. You're not like us. Your bodies can't survive what ours can. You don't have our advantages. How can you say that? Jason's expression didn't change, but there was a certain sadness in his eyes, as though he was remembering something. It's true. Our bodies are weaker in some ways. We can't live without protection like your people can. But we survive. We adapt. Aloria tilted her head, still unsure. What do you mean? Jason turned away from the window and looked at her, his eyes finally meeting hers with an intensity that sent a small chill down her spine. We don't have the power to change our biology. We can't adapt to our environment as easily as you can, but we've learned how to survive. We learned to think differently, to solve problems in ways other species wouldn't. He took a few steps toward her. It's not our strength that makes us dangerous, Aloria. It's our mind. We can always find a way. Aloria was silent for a long moment. Jason's words lingered in the air, and for the first time, she understood. The human strength wasn't just physical. It wasn't in their bodies, their armor, or their technology. It was in their resilience, their ability to think, to adapt, to overcome obstacles when everything seemed impossible. So, that's your secret? Aloria asked softly. Your ability to keep going, no matter what. Jason nodded. Exactly. For the first time in their conversation, Aloria smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. She had expected him to give some grand, complicated explanation, but instead, his answer was simple, honest. You're right, she said, her voice quieter now. That's something I didn't see before. She paused, her thoughts running deep. I've always believed that strength comes from power, from the mind. Yes, but also from the body, from weapons, from control. She looked up at him. But now, I'm beginning to see that you humans are strong in a way I never understood. Jason's smile was soft but genuine. We're not perfect, Aloria. We have our flaws. But we never give up. That's what makes us different. Aloria looked at him for a long time, her mind racing with new thoughts and realizations. She had thought of humans as weak, as fragile, but now she saw them in a new light. They weren't strong in the same way Xerthians were, but they had a strength of their own, a strength that came from the heart. I think I've underestimated you, Jason, Aloria said, her voice filled with a mix of respect and curiosity. I thought I understood your people, but now, I'm not so sure. Jason didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this shift. Most people do, he said, his tone quiet but confident. But maybe you'll understand us better now. Aloria smiled again, this time a little wider. She had spent so much time believing that strength was about power, about control, about dominance. But Jason had shown her that sometimes strength was simply about survival. And maybe, just maybe, that was what made humans so remarkable. As they stood there, the stars twinkling outside the window, Aloria realized that this was only the beginning. The more she learned about humans, the more she felt like there was still so much to discover, not just about them, but about herself. The following days passed quickly, each filled with meetings and discussions about the future of the galaxy. Earth's representatives had proven themselves to be capable diplomats, and the Xerthians, though hesitant at first, were beginning to accept the humans' place at the table. Aloria found herself more and more intrigued by the Earthlings, especially Jason. He was everywhere, calm, composed, and always ready to listen. One afternoon, After another long session of negotiations, Eloria found herself walking through the station's gardens. The space had been designed to mimic the feel of the natural world, with holographic trees, gently flowing streams, and brightly colored flowers. It was a place for reflection, a place to clear the mind after the chaos of political discussions. Eloria wandered slowly, her mind still racing with thoughts of the humans. She had come to respect them more than she ever thought possible. Jason, especially, was always there, always willing to help, always standing firm in his belief in humanity. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite understand. She stopped by a quiet fountain and sat on a smooth stone bench. The sound of water flowing was peaceful, but her mind refused to calm. What was it about Jason that unsettled her? Why did she feel this strange pull whenever he was around? Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Eloria turned, expecting to see one of the council members, but instead, she was met with Jason. "Princess Eloria," he said, his voice calm and friendly. He had clearly been walking through the garden as well. "I didn't expect to find you here." Eloria smiled faintly. "I needed a moment to myself." She gestured to the bench beside her. "Would you care to join me?" Jason hesitated for only a moment before sitting down beside her. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the peaceful sounds of the garden surrounding them. Eloria could feel his presence next to her, and though she was used to being alone, there was something strangely comforting about his company. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," she said, breaking the silence, "about humanity's strength. I think I'd finally understand it. It's not about physical power, it's about resilience, about not giving up, no matter how tough things get." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've got it. It's about survival. The ability to keep going when everyone else would give up." Eloria paused, studying him. She had noticed that Jason never spoke of strength in terms of force or domination. It was always about endurance, about finding a way to keep moving forward, even when things seemed impossible. "But you haven't told me everything," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "I know there's more to you than just being a soldier or a diplomat. What drives you, Jason? What makes you keep going?" Jason's face softened, and for a moment, Eloria saw a vulnerability in him that she hadn't noticed before. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about him. He turned to face her fully. "It's not just about survival. It's about protecting the people I care about. I come from a long line of soldiers, people who fought for a cause. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the real fight is about those you love. If you can protect them, if you can give them a future, then you've done something worth fighting for." Eloria's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard someone speak so simply about something so deep. It wasn't about victory, fame, or power. It was about love. "And that's why you fight?" she asked quietly. Jason's expression grew more serious. "That's why I keep going. For my people. For the ones I love. Because without them, there's no point." Eloria was silent for a moment, her mind spinning. She had always believed in the Xerthian way. That strength was about control, about dominance. But Jason's words stirred something deep within her. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. Was there more to strength than just physical power? "I think I've been looking at this all wrong," she said softly, her voice almost to herself. "I've been focused on power, on winning. But what if the true strength lies in something else?" Jason turned to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe it does." Before Eloria could respond, there was a sudden, unexpected sound. A loud explosion followed by a series of tremors that shook the station. The ground beneath them rumbled, and the peaceful garden was instantly filled with the sounds of alarms and chaos. Eloria stood up quickly, her instincts kicking in. "What is happening?" she demanded. Jason's face went tense as he scanned the horizon. "Something's wrong. We need to move now." Without thinking, Eloria followed Jason as he sprinted toward the command center. The station was in a state of emergency, and everyone seemed to be scrambling to find answers. Aloria had never felt anything like this before. The sudden shift from peace to panic was overwhelming. As they arrived at the command center, the situation became clear. The station was under attack. Unknown forces had somehow breached the outer defenses, and the alarms were blaring in every corner. The entire station was on lockdown. Jason turned to Aloria, his expression hardening. "This is no time for political games. We need to work together if we're going to survive." Aloria's heart raced, but she nodded. "I'm with you." Jason's eyes met hers, and in that moment, something changed. The respect between them, the understanding, had grown deeper. They weren't just two leaders of different species anymore. They were allies, facing a challenge that would require everything they had. And for the first time, Aloria realized that Jason wasn't just a human warrior. He was a leader, someone who fought for something bigger than himself, someone who would stand by her no matter what. The station was in chaos. Every corner buzzed with activity as the attack on the station continued. The alarms blared louder, signaling more breaches in the outer defense. Aloria felt a surge of adrenaline as she and Jason made their way to the central command room. Soldiers, engineers, and officials rushed past them, all focused on containing the damage and ensuring the safety of the civilians. Jason's face was set in a hard, determined expression as he moved with a purpose. Aloria tried to keep up, her own mind racing with thoughts of how this could happen. She had never seen anything like this before. Zerth was a peaceful planet, and the idea of someone attacking the station seemed almost impossible. But now, here they were, fighting for their survival. "We don't have much time," Jason said, his voice low and urgent. "The attack is more organized than we thought. Whoever is behind this has been planning it for a while." Aloria nodded, her heart pounding. She had to admit, Jason was right. The attackers weren't just causing random destruction. They were targeting critical areas, trying to disable the station's defenses. This was no ordinary raid. This was an all-out assault, and they needed to act fast. "We need to get to the control center," Aloria said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "We can't stop the attack without shutting down their access points." Jason didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." The two of them made their way through the corridors, avoiding the chaos as much as possible. They passed teams of soldiers preparing to fight and civilians being evacuated to the safer parts of the station. Aloria's heart ached at the sight. There were so many people here, so many lives at risk. She couldn't allow this to continue. They reached the central control room, and Jason immediately took charge. He didn't wait for orders or formalities. He went straight to the main console and began typing in commands. Aloria stood behind him, watching as the human quickly accessed the station's security systems. "I'm locking down the outer airlocks," Jason muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "It'll slow them down, but we need more time." Aloria stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room. "What else can we do?" Jason looked up at her, his expression grave. "We need to find out who's behind this. Whoever planned this attack knows what they're doing. We need intelligence." Before Aloria could respond, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. The door to the control room shook, and the sound of boots pounding the metal floor grew louder. Aloria's heart skipped a beat. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice tight. Jason stood up from the console. "I'll go out and buy you some time. You stay here and keep working." Aloria was about to protest, but Jason was already moving toward the door, his mind focused on the task at hand. "Jason, wait." She called after him, her voice catching in her throat. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was something about the way he looked at her, calm, steady, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. "I'll be fine. Just trust me." Aloria hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Be careful." Jason gave her a small, reassuring smile before stepping out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Aloria stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She wanted to help. She wanted to fight. But she knew Jason was right. She needed to stay in the control room and keep the station's systems operational. The safety of everyone aboard depended on her. She turned back to the console and began typing in commands. The system was overloaded, and several of the security measures had already been disabled by the attackers. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had to find a way to regain control. Outside, Jason moved quickly through the hallways, his heart racing. He had been in many dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about fighting to survive. This was about protecting the people he cared about. And right now, that meant Eloria. He rounded a corner just as a group of attackers appeared, their weapons raised. Jason didn't hesitate. He charged forward, using the element of surprise to his advantage. The attackers never saw him coming. He took them down one by one, his movements swift and efficient. He wasn't thinking about the fight itself. He was thinking about the people he was protecting, thinking about Eloria. When the last of the attackers fell, Jason stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with effort. He didn't have time to rest. He had to keep moving. He pressed on, knowing that every second counted. But as he moved through the corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this attack, something bigger than just a simple raid. He needed answers. Meanwhile, back in the control room, Eloria was focused. The seconds felt like hours as she worked to restore the station's security systems. She could feel the pressure mounting with every passing minute. The attackers were getting closer, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Finally, she found the breach. Someone had hacked into the system, giving the attackers access to the station's core defenses. She quickly began the process of locking them out. But it wasn't enough. The attackers were still inside the system. Eloria's mind raced as she realized the truth. It's not just an attack. It's a betrayal. The enemy wasn't some unknown force. It was someone from within the station itself. Eloria's hands shook as she worked furiously at the control panel. Her mind raced with the terrifying realization. The attackers weren't strangers. They were someone from within the station. Someone who knew how to bypass the security systems and had access to the station's core defenses. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she stood still, her thoughts swirling. Who could have done this? She wondered. There were so many people in the council, in the station's ranks, but who among them could betray their own people like this? The thought unsettled her, but there was no time to dwell on it. Focus, Eloria. Focus, she told herself. She had to stop the attack, no matter the cost. She began typing faster, locking out the rogue access points one by one. But the system was complicated. The enemy was good, too good. Whoever had infiltrated the station's network had planned this for a long time. It wasn't just a breach, it was a full-scale attack. Outside, Jason continued to fight, his every movement sharp and calculated. He knew time was running out. The station was still under siege, and the attackers were making their way deeper into the facility. But Jason wasn't just fighting to survive. He had to protect everyone here, especially Eloria. As he moved through the halls, he could hear the sounds of combat. The echoes of weapons being fired and soldiers shouting orders filled the air. The attackers had arrived in force, and they were determined to take the station. But Jason refused to let them win. He had seen too many wars, too many losses, to let this be another one. He reached another corridor, where more attackers waited. This time, they were prepared, expecting him. They raised their weapons as he entered, but Jason didn't flinch. He moved faster than they could react, his combat training kicking in. In seconds, the attackers were on the ground, but Jason knew this wouldn't last forever. There were more coming. He heard a voice in his ear. It was Eloria, her voice calm but tense. "Jason, we have a problem," she said. "I've located the breach. Someone from within the station is responsible for this attack. They've been feeding information to the enemy, and they're using our own systems to bring us down." Jason's blood ran cold. Do you know who it is? There was a pause. Not yet, but I'm working on it. We can't afford to let them get any deeper into the station. I need you to keep fighting and buy me some time. Jason gritted his teeth. I'll do what I can. He disconnected the call, his mind spinning with the new information. This wasn't just an attack. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to bring the entire station to its knees. He couldn't let that happen. As he moved forward, he heard the distinct sound of approaching footsteps. He quickly ducked behind a corner, his heart racing. The attackers were closing in, but he wasn't afraid. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anything stop him. Eloria, meanwhile, continued her work in the control room. Her fingers danced across the keys as she fought against the rogue access points. She had to find the traitor. There was no way they could win without stopping the leak within their own ranks, but she also knew it wasn't going to be easy. Whoever had planned this attack was cunning, and they wouldn't be caught easily. Suddenly, the lights in the control room flickered. Eloria's heart skipped a beat. The attackers had managed to cut power to certain sections of the station. She wasn't sure how long the backup systems would hold, but she knew it wouldn't be long. Come on, Eloria muttered under her breath, her fingers moving faster. She needed a breakthrough. Just as she was about to give up, a name appeared on the screen. A name she didn't expect to see. It was one of the higher-ranking officials, a trusted member of the council. Eloria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. No, she whispered to herself, it can't be him. But the evidence was clear. He had been the one feeding information to the attackers. He had been the one who enabled the breach. And now, everything made sense. I can't believe this, she said quietly, her voice filled with disbelief. She had trusted this person. They had worked side by side for months, and now it turned out they had been plotting against them all along. Eloria felt a surge of anger rise within her. How could someone she had trusted betray them so easily? But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the time for anger. There were lives at stake. Jason, Eloria called into the communicator, her voice firm. I know who it is. It's Counselor Vendor. He's the one who's been working with the attackers. Jason's voice came back, filled with disbelief. Vendor, are you sure? Eloria's eyes narrowed as she looked at the evidence on the screen. Positive. He's been using his access to sabotage the station's systems. Jason was silent for a moment, clearly processing the news. We need to stop him. I'll make sure he doesn't get away. Eloria's heart raced as she looked at the map of the station. He's heading toward the main power grid. If he gets there, he'll disable everything. Jason cursed under his breath. I'm on my way. Eloria's mind raced as she watched the data unfold before her. She had to stay focused. The station wasn't just under attack. It was being sabotaged from within. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Jason was already on the move, heading straight for the counselor's location. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this betrayal destroy everything they had worked for. The station was on the brink of collapse. The corridors were filled with the sounds of soldiers running, alarms blaring, and the distant thrum of power being cut off in various sections. Jason's heart pounded as he made his way through the twisting hallways, determined to stop Counselor Vendor before it was too late. Vendor was a high-ranking official, someone Eloria had once trusted implicitly. But now, as the traitor's betrayal was revealed, Jason knew that every second counted. If Vendor reached the power grid, the entire station would be plunged into darkness, making it impossible to regain control of the situation. Jason moved quickly, his every step filled with purpose. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of the counselor or his allies. The closer he got to the power grid, the more dangerous the mission became. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He had a job to do. Meanwhile, in the control room, Eloria continued to work tirelessly. The weight of the betrayal hung heavily in her mind, But she couldn't afford to dwell on it. There was still work to be done. With every second that passed, Vendor was getting closer to the power grid. "Jason, are you almost there?" Eloria's voice came through the communicator, steady but laced with concern. "I'm close," Jason replied, his voice low. "But I'm not the only one here. Vendor's men are all around the grid. I'll need a distraction." Eloria's fingers flew across the controls as she searched for any way to help him. The station's systems were still heavily compromised, but she found an emergency security feature that could temporarily disable the station's outer shields. It wasn't much, but it could create an opening. "I've got a way to give you some cover. You'll need to move fast," she said, a plan forming in her mind. "Once you're close, I'll trigger the shield override. It'll give you a few seconds to get through." Jason's voice came back through the earpiece, calm but filled with urgency. "I'll make it work. Keep me posted." The line went silent, and Eloria's hands moved quickly, setting the override in motion. She held her breath as she watched the countdown. Jason was counting on her. They were both counting on each other to get this right. Jason rounded the final corner and saw the power grid access point. Counselor Vendor's men were standing guard, weapons raised. The sight of them only fueled Jason's determination. These were the last obstacles between him and stopping the disaster that was about to unfold. He paused in the shadows, assessing the situation. There were at least 5 guards standing near the grid access point, each one alert and ready for a fight. Jason knew he didn't have the time to take them all down quietly. He had to act fast. As the countdown on the shield override continued, he took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. This wasn't just about fighting off the attackers. This was about stopping the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. With a sharp nod to himself, Jason sprang into action. He moved with incredible speed, taking out the first 2 guards with swift, precise moves. They barely had time to react before they were unconscious on the ground. The remaining guards turned to face him, shouting orders into their communication devices. Jason didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his body moving instinctively, his combat training taking over. Each movement was calculated, each strike aimed at disarming and incapacitating his opponents without wasting any time. The guards fought back, but they were no match for Jason's speed and experience. Within moments, all 5 were on the ground, either unconscious or too injured to continue. Jason stood over them, breathing heavily, his muscles aching from the intense combat. "Eloria," he said into the communicator, his voice sharp. "I'm at the grid. Start the override now." Eloria's voice came back almost immediately, her tone filled with relief. "It's done. You have 30 seconds before the shields go back up." Jason didn't wait for another word. He moved quickly to the access point, his hands flying over the controls. He needed to make sure that the power grid was secure, that it wouldn't be taken down by the traitors who had caused this mess. The countdown on his communicator was ticking down rapidly, and he could hear the faint hum of the shields beginning to activate again. He managed to reach the core control panel, but before he could finish his task, a voice behind him called out, cold and commanding. "Well, well, it seems you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, human." Jason spun around, his heart racing as he came face to face with Counselor Vendor. The traitor stood there, a smirk on his face, clearly enjoying the moment. He had been waiting for this confrontation, and Jason knew that it would be the fight of his life. Vendor's men were closing in, but Jason was ready. This wasn't just about stopping the attack anymore. This was personal. "You've betrayed everything you stood for," Jason said, his voice low but filled with disgust. "You're willing to burn it all down just for your own gain." Vendor's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "The galaxy is changing, human. You wouldn't understand. I did what was necessary to ensure our survival." Jason's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, determination burning in his chest. "No, you did it for power." With that, he lunged at Vendor, the final confrontation beginning.